Hello, hello. We're talking about section 7.4 today on memory and all kinds of exciting things. So I have a comic to share with you. You know, I'm a huge fan of Calvin and Hobbes. So found one on memory. Calvin, I'm writing a book about my life. It's called Calvin, the Shocking True Story of the Boy Whose Exploits Panicked the Nation. Interesting title. Thanks. Specifically, what exploits you're referring to? Well, that's the problem. Can you help me think of some I could do? Here I am, all set to write my autobiography, and I'm stuck. What's the problem? I can't remember the whole first half of my life. We call that infantile amnesia. Maybe your mom knows what she did. I asked her. She said I did revolting things that are probably unpublishable. Well, no wonder you've suppressed the memories. There you go, Freudian repression. We've been talking about that. Maybe I was in jail. Calvin, Memoirs of a 6-Year-Old. My life has been a fascinating series of amazing exploits about which I have many profound insights, but frankly, none of it is any of your business, so butt out. The end. Do publishers demand that manuscripts be typed? I wouldn't sweat it. I like the way that Hobbes deadpans, right? Clearly, no one's going to publish that. Okay, so I have a memory task for you. If you remember last week when we were covering section 7.2, I asked you to memorize, to look at a picture of 20 objects for 45 seconds and then write everything down. So without looking at that, I want you right now on a piece of paper, whatever you got nearby, to write out which of the 20 objects you remember. And then I asked you to memorize 20 different pictures using the method of loci, where I asked you to come up with a place that you knew, or places you knew very, very well, and you were supposed to list out 20 locations. And then I had you look at another picture and another group of pictures and use the method of loci. So try to remember your locations and then write out how many of those you remember and then compare. What I'm hoping is that you remember many more of the method of loci than the first method, whichever method you used. So I'm going to you can do that. You can hit pause, but I'm going to show you the PowerPoint from 7.2. And so you can see the picture. So this was the first picture. So hopefully you paused it before you looked at this. So this is the first set of 20. So you can see how you did, if you remembered any of them. And then I'm going to show you the method of loci group here in a second. So if you didn't do that, pause it and actually do it, just to test yourself. So here's the method of loci group of pictures. So I'm very interested in how you did, because it's been, what, a week or almost a week since we did this. So did you remember anything? I'm thinking you did. The method of loci is pretty good if you do it right. Okay, let's move into today's lesson, which is on section 7.4 in your notes. So you want to take your notes out. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but I'll throw up a picture of the notes here so we can all look at them together. All right, so this is 7.4. Zoom it in here a second. Maybe that helps to see it a bit better. Actually, what we should do first is we should go over. No, okay. Well, this is good. We'll start here. Let me focus it a second. All right. This is an extremely important lesson, especially if you're going to go into college. All right, the flip side of memory, which is forgetting. So forgetting happens at any of the memory stages that we looked at, short-term, sensory, long-term. And this is, how often do we say, oh, I wish I could remember that, but I forgot, or you forget to get something at the store, or you forget something on a test that you knew. We all have these problems. So basic memory tasks. There's a memory researcher named Hermann Ebbinghaus. Hence, we have the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve on the right. And he did a study using nonsense symbols. So you might be thinking, what is a nonsense syllable? Sorry, nonsense syllable. And a nonsense syllable is made up of two consonants with a vowel in between that is not a real word. So so let's see if we can I'm thinking fun would be a word. Fup, let's say, or math. So basically you take two consonants, you put a vowel in between, and obviously there's dozens and dozens of these, and it can't be a real word. So fun wouldn't work, or mad, or mob, or what. So any three-letter word doesn't work. So he took these nonsense syllables, and then he used them to test his memory. And so what he would do is he would memorize lists of these until he knew them perfectly without mistakes. And then he would retest himself after elapsed periods of time to see how many he could still remember. And sometimes, and he would also, in different experiments, he would relearn the nonsense syllables. And then he would see how much time it took him to relearn them and measure that across the time it took him to learn them initially, and showing how you could relearn things quicker than you can learn them initially. So like you'd have how much time it took him to learn the syllables the first time, and then how much time it took him to memorize the list, relearn the list the second time, and then a third time, etc. And he showed how much quicker the relearning process was. And this is a big deal, as we'll see. So this is looking at forgetting, and yeah, this took him years of research. Very disciplined man, where he did all kinds of different variations, and he did it over and over to replicate his work with himself and to come up with his conclusions. And the reason he used these nonsense syllables is because he knew if he used things in real life, like if even like looking at a list of pictures, like we did at the beginning of this lesson, you can connect pictures to different events in your life. And so it's not novel. So the idea with nonsense syllables is he's never seen these before. He has no memory associations with them. So every time he's learning a list of nonsense syllables, it has no connection to anything in his mind. So it's like a raw form of a memory task. Okay, so let's look the forgetting curve itself. You see how much, if you memorize it completely, and then 20 minutes later, what you remember drops to 58%, an hour 44%, 9 hours, sorry, 1 hour, I don't know, yeah, 9 hours a day, etc., all the way to a month. So you see how there's like a leveling out here, but it just shows you how weak your memory is if you don't revisit the material. And we're going to get back to that. Okay, recognition, recall, and relearning. These are three basic memory tasks. Recognition means to identify objects or events that have been encountered before. Identifying objects or events that have been encountered before. It's the easiest of the memory tasks. This is kind of like multiple choice on a test. Like when you're, you might, if you have to pick from four things, like if I said, which psychologists use nonsense syllables when you take this test? You might look at Loftus, Ebbinghaus, Bartlett, etc. These different people we've been talking about, and you might not remember, but you look at the list and you recognize, oh, Ebbinghaus, and then it comes back to you. So easiest of the memory tasks. And it's easier to remember faces than names. So you might recognize, you ever have that? You go to a grocery store, some other place, you recognize a person's face. I know that person, but you can't think of their name. Recognition's easier with faces than names. I forgot to mention, I'm gonna throw it in here. By the way, Ebbinghaus, although he did all these experiments with himself, years later, other psychologists replicated his studies with other subjects. So we know that they're sound conclusions. All right, letter C, recall. It means to bring back to mind. Immediate recall can be close to 100% if you just memorize something. After an hour, you can lose almost half. So you see that on the forgetting curve, 58% it says. And then letter D, relearning. So I think relearning is huge. And what Ebbinghaus learned about relearning was that he was much more efficient relearning material than he was the first time he learned it. And so this is kind of a foundational concept in education, because yeah, you might go through algebra and think, oh, I didn't learn much. But then you might revisit some of those concepts in geometry. You might revisit them again in advanced algebra. And you have it where you're like, oh, I've seen that before. And then you quickly are able to relearn it much more quickly than when you first learned it. And this goes for other things too, history, science, etc. So, and obviously someday, if God blesses you and you have children, you might have a circumstance. I'm seeing this kind of on social media right now, where all these parents are having to homeschool their kids, and they're struggling with like math things, and they have to relearn it. They have to go back to the book and kind of teach themselves how to do it again. Like, oh, okay, I remember how to factor or something, because they could quickly relearn it, or hopefully relearn it. Okay, and then I have over here overcoming the curve, and this also is very important. So what happens if you revisit the material? So, okay, yeah, you could have this forgetting curve like we saw above, right? If you don't revisit the material. What happens if 10 minutes later you review? Well, you see here what one review will do, right? It changes the curve so that 1 week later you remember significantly more. What if you review 2 times? So immediately after you learn something, and then 24 hours later, so the day later, you review the material. Well, you see this yellow curve. And so in 24 hours, obviously you're back to 100%. Now, a week later, you're closer to 50 to 60%. And you kind of plateau at like 30% instead of at like less than 10. What if you, 1 week later, you review it again? You see your plateau is significantly improved here, even out to much longer time period. And obviously, if you reviewed it again a month later. So this takes a lot of discipline. But the idea is if you're in college, you're in a class, even this material here, right? If you were to go back through this later today, just glance at your notes, read through it. If you're to glance at it tomorrow. So yeah, one theory is that if you just went over your notes every day, I had a buddy in college who did this. Every day at the end of all of his classes, he would go back through all the notes he took that day and just read through them. And he never studied. And he just, by reading through his notes every day, he learned other material. So it came to a test, he knew the stuff. Now, some of you are like, I don't have time every day. By the time I get done with my homework, I don't have any extra time. Yeah, I guess you just try to find a way to make time. Like, you know, back in the day when you rode buses to and from school, you look over your notes in the bus, or even in your mind, if you process things, right? So let's say you're going out for a 20-minute jog, and you just say, hey, on my first 10 minutes of my jog, I'm going to think back of what I learned in psychology today. And my next 10 minutes of my jog, I'm going to think to, you know, this other class, history or whatever. Then that's a way to, anytime you're going back through information in your head, it makes a huge difference. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, moving along here. All right, different kinds of forgetting, interference, and decay. So, or sorry, interference and decay. So we've talked about interference, how different things, you know, if you put different things in your mind, whether it's your cell phone buzzing, or in my case right now, my stupid dog whining, yeah, it can interfere. You see that I paused a few moments because my thinking to myself, how can I get this dog to be quiet? And then decay is just that natural erosion of memory. If you don't revisit it, it just fades away. So repression, we've reviewed that several times. It's the idea that the Freudian idea that people bury painful memories mentally, you know, they're subconsciously to function, they forget things on purpose, but this has not been, it's a theory, as it's been demonstrated clearly, as we've looked at several times. All right, amnesia. The definition is severe memory loss caused by brain injury, shock, fatigue, illness, or repression. Severe memory loss caused by brain injury, shock, fatigue, illness, and then some people say repression. So let's look at, there's actually a psychological form of amnesia that I didn't put here separately, but you can put under the definition, which is dissociative amnesia. I'll just write that word down since it's not here. So there's a group of disorders we call dissociative disorders, and dissociative amnesia caused by psychological trauma is basically you forget your previous existence. Some people like move into different towns, leave their families, start brand new jobs and a brand new life, and it's like they've completely forgotten they existed before they moved to this new city or whatever. That's one form. So that's, you know, like I said, psychological trauma, something terrible usually has happened in that circumstance. Okay, so let's look at did I miss one here? Okay, definition. Okay, letter B, infantile amnesia. I mentioned that in the Calvin Hobbes comic. Infantile amnesia, we have no real memories before we're 3 or 4 years old. Now, Freud said this was because of repression. We're not agreeing with that, at least I'm not. But biological psychologists say, hey, your hippocampus, which is vital in memory, you learn that from reading HM, which we'll get to, your hippocampus doesn't mature until you're at least 2. And so your ability to form memories. Now, here's the deal. Like, obviously, if you have younger siblings, you know this, or if you know any young kids, this doesn't mean that kids can't remember things. They obviously do. They know who their parents are, their grandparents. They've met people, they remember them. It's like, you know, as soon as they can start talking, which also is a valuable part of memory, they clearly remember all kinds of things. And procedural memory, obviously, if they learn how to walk and talk and eat, and they don't forget that, they obviously may retain that. The idea here is that, like, when you're at your age, a teenager, how much do you remember from your 2, 3 years old? Now, you might say, oh, I remember something that happened to me when I was 2. Oftentimes, this is because, you know, your mom or whatever has told you this happened to you when you were 2. And so you've formed a memory. Think back to Loftus and how she was told that she found her mother in the pool when really it was her aunt. She created a false memory. You can easily have false memories, or even memories that are true that people created for you, because they say things like, oh, when you were 2, you, you know, broke your finger. And you're like, I don't. And you went to the hospital, don't you remember? Right? So they're asking you leading questions, and you form that memory. But it's very improbable that you would have memories from when you're really young. So part of it hippocampus, part of it you don't talk yet. And so this is really looking at episodic memories. For some reason, we don't retain them from when we're very young. And that's probably a good thing too, because who wants to remember, like, right, I'm just thinking of memories from my own kids, like when my oldest daughter, was a baby. Yeah, she's probably, I don't know, 1.5, whatever. My brother-in-law played basketball in high school, so we went to one of his games. We sat next to my father-in-law. Of course, he wants to hold the baby, his granddaughter. He's holding the baby. She just diarrhea bombs her pants out. I mean, obviously had a diaper on, but it didn't matter. I mean, it was everywhere, up her back, whatever. So he's holding on to her so that she's facing outwards. She's kind of sitting in his lap. And then his whole front of his shirt was just saturated. It was nasty. And I mean, would she want to remember that? I mean, she doesn't remember that. But it's like, do you really want to remember the time that you blew out your diaper and soaked your grandpa? No. So there's lots of good things that we don't have memories from when we were wee lads and lasses. Okay, letter C, anterograde amnesia. This is memory loss from trauma that prevents a person from forming memories. So this is like the case of HM. So I'm going to bip over to that a minute so we can have an example. So you were supposed to read this. So let me throw it up here. All right, so the story of HM, this man suffering from severe epilepsy, and Wilder Penfield, this neurosurgeon, was doing surgeries where he removed parts of the temporal lobe, and including the hippocampus, to help severe epilepsy. And this had some unintended consequences for this man, HM. And so he's going to experience what we call anterograde amnesia. And so what Brenda Milner did, the researcher here, she did all these different kind of tests on this guy to figure out what he could and could not do. And so this the first part of the article kind of goes through how, yeah, you have a conversation, 15 minutes later, he doesn't even know he met you. He has this problem transferring memory, and didn't know famous people after his surgery, but can remember famous people who became famous before his surgery. Couldn't remember how to get to where he lived, couldn't remember how to get to the bathroom in the hospital, etc. And so you got a couple of quotes here. He says, right now I'm wondering, have I done or said anything amiss? You see this at this moment, everything looks clear to me, but what happened just before? That's what worries me. It's like waking from a dream. I just don't remember. Then on another occasion, he said, every day is alone in itself, whatever enjoyment I've had, whatever sorrow I've had. So for example, his uncle died after he had the surgery. And so when obviously the first time he heard his uncle's death, he mourned. But then in subsequent times, he asked, like, hey, how come my uncle hasn't come to visit me? And how's my uncle doing? And they had to tell him again, he's dead. And then it hit him just like it hit him the first time, like he never knew his uncle had died. So it's extremely painful. Some of his, obviously his previous memories were intact, but making new memories was the problem. But the interesting thing is he could make some types of new memories. So this really illustrated the difference in our memory systems. So for example, the Tower of Hanoi problem. So if I bit back to my document camera here a second. So here's the Tower of Hanoi problem, and you've probably solved this in the course of this reading, being the curious minds that you are. And maybe there's multiple ways to solve it, but just one way. So the idea here is you only can move one disk at a time, and the rule is you can never put a larger disk on top of a smaller disk, and you have to get all these disks over here stacked like this on this peg over here. So the way I did it is I took the smallest one here and I move it to here. And then I take the next one down and I move it to here. And then I take this small peg here that I moved and I put it on top of the middle peg. So now I have these two stacked just like this here. And this is open. So I can move the largest peg here. Largest disk, sorry, onto this peg. So then I got to work backwards. I got to take this small disk and I got to move it back onto this empty peg. And then I can take the medium disk, which is at the bottom here, move it here, and then I could take the small disk and move it on top, and then I've transferred. Okay, so maybe you did that, and maybe it took a moment or two to figure that out. But once you have it figured out, right, lickety split, you could do it again. And so they did this with HM. So getting back to that, they did this with HM, and he was able to, once he had solved the problem the first time, he was able to do it quickly the second time. So it says, confronted with it again later on, he ran through the procedure quickly and easily. Had he seen the problem before? Obviously, he says no. He has no memory of seeing this problem before. How could he solve it so quickly? He said it was easy, but obviously it's not. So it's kind of interesting. He could make this procedural, more of a procedural memory. And so the author here goes through the differences, which I'm sure you've read. And then there's this fill in the blank here where it's like, what word is this? And the word is elephant. Now, if you have a conversation about elephant first, and then you show this, it quickly comes to your mind. But if you just look at it, maybe you had a hard time. So it says, it turns out amnesic patients also show this defective priming. If they are first primed with the word elephant, then given the problem to solve a few minutes later, they solve it very quickly. How are you able to solve the problem so fast? It was easy. Had we been talking about elephants? They don't remember it, even though they had. They say no. So that's kind of interesting too. Like it's somewhere in there. Like it's not in their episodic memory that they talked about elephant, but somehow in the brain, in the memory system, that idea of elephant is there somewhere. So we're still trying to, obviously this is a finding out process. One of the most amazing things about this reading is to learn about Korsakoff syndrome. So this idea happens with chronic alcoholics, and they fill in details. So it says the brains of Korsakoff patients show damage to a system not identical with but closely interconnected with some of the systems damaged in the case of HM. And they do this thing called confabulating, where they fill in the blanks with false memories, but it's not like believable false memories. It's just like crazy answers. And it appears like they have no concept that they're really doing this. It's like their memory has a hole, and so they just fill it in with something that, to them, they say it completely like it's plausible, even though it's not. So when a hospitalized patient was asked, "Where have you been?" he said he had just returned from Paris by airplane, which obviously cannot be the case. So kind of crazy way that their brain, we already talked about reconstruction in memory, how, for example, in the Bartlett War of Ghosts things, when you reconstruct the memory, you might fill it in with things that didn't happen, or with leading questions, or in Loftus research. In this case, you're filling it in with things that could not possibly have happened, but you actually think they maybe could have. So that's pretty profound. And so as the conclusion here, we have different memory systems, and they're somewhat distinct in our brain. And our memory is not a tape recorder. Okay, let's go back to the notes. All right, then we have, so that's interrogated amnesia. So the case of HM often has damage to the hippocampus, is a common feature here. So you can't form new memories. Then you have retrograde amnesia, where people forget the period leading up to a traumatic event. So, and sometimes it could be, you could lose months or years of your memory. So there's an example in the textbook about a motorcyclist who got in a severe accident. When he woke up from a coma, he thought he was 11 years old. He lost all his memory for many, many years. He was obviously 11 years old when he had the accident. So he eventually regained quite a bit of his memory, but obviously if you wake up and you've missed out on a decade or more of your memories, that's pretty crazy. You can also get this from having a concussion. I don't know if any of you have had a concussion before, but you can blank out and not remember significant things that happened leading up to the trauma, and that can be frustrating. So I've had experience with retrograde amnesia a bit. One of the examples that comes to mind is going into one of my knee surgeries. So I had, tore my ACL, and I think this was the first time, my left knee. And so I was there, and they put, they had an anesthesiologist come in and put a nerve block in my femoral nerve in my leg. And then they gave me some, drugs or whatever before they wheeled me back to surgery. Now, my wife was there all the way till they wheeled me back, and when these drugs start to take effect, she said that I started asking questions of the nurse who was there and whoever else, and I was saying really funny things. Now, you know me, I have tried year after year to be funny, and I never managed to be funny. So my wife told me that for once in my life, I was actually funny. The problem is I have no memory of it. I have no memory of talking to these people, or what I said that was funny, or people actually laughing at things that I said. And so this is a terrible circumstance for me. I was funny once in my life, and I can't even remember that I was funny. So I was funny once. My wife says I was. I just can't remember it. She also said I was embarrassing myself. So maybe it's a good thing I don't remember. Okay, so that's retrograde amnesia. All right, improving memory, the last section here. So how can you improve your memory? Well, drill and practice. This is like flashcards. It's boring, but it works. Ebbinghaus, using nonsense syllables, found that, okay, so he would learn things and be able to repeat them without mistake, but if he continued to learn them, so like if you memorize your flashcards for like anatomy terminology or something, and you memorize them, but if you keep going through them, even though you already can do them perfectly, that slows down that forgetting curve. So drill and practice. Obviously relate to things you already know, laborative rehearsal. So like method of loci, right? And any way you can connect to prior knowledge, any way is going to help you remember things. More connections, the better. So always strive. So when you're sitting in class, when you're listening to this video, even though it could be boring, any mental activity you can do to try to relate what I'm saying to something in your life, it's going to help you remember it. Form unusual associations. So some people are really good at this. They're very creative, and so they're trying to they make up stuff when they're studying for tests, and they associate terms and ideas with crazy different things. My mind just does not work that way. So maybe you can think of times or people who have done that. That is not a successful strategy for me. My mind just doesn't think that way. Letter D, construct links. So this is a type of laborative rehearsal. It's often used in like vocabulary. So like the only foreign language I have some idea about is Spanish. And you just think of like, because there's English words and Spanish words, some of them both have Latin roots, then it can kind of help you remember. So like I remember the Spanish word for moon, luna. Well, we have words in English language that also have that same root, like lunar and lunatic, someone who's crazy because of the moon. But that luna, like that all is related. That's a link. Vive, the word for live in Spanish. We have an English word like vivacious, which means lively. So fan, in the English language, you have fanatic or something like that in Spanish. So there's just lots of different words. These are links, right? A constructed link is something that's a commonality between terms. And then the last thing I have is mnemonic devices. That's letter E, which is not on your sheet. Oh, I just kind of put it at the top. So, sorry. We would consider all these to be mnemonic devices, just anything that helps you to remember information. And it's any strategy to improve memory. So that could be acronyms, it could be phrases like Roy G. Biv, it could be rhymes, songs, any of those things. So if you've got questions, go ahead and email me. Hopefully you don't forget what you learned about forgetting.